A week ago, I got a Facebook message from a woman I don't know. Normally, I would have been inclined to ignore it, and that's what I did at first. She kept sending them, though. The last one caught my attention. I didn't even have to open it to read it, as it was barely more than a sentence. Please, it's about Jules. I opened it immediately and browsed through the backlog of messages she'd sent over the past couple of days. From what I could gather, things were bad. At first, I had no idea why she would contact me. We hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, and after the way our friendship ended, I didn't think I'd be high on her list of emergency contacts. As I continued reading, I realized that it was because Jules didn't have anyone else. I wasn't that surprised. She cut off contact with me and the rest of our friend group a little while after her boyfriend, my best friend, had died in a car accident that had left her seriously injured our freshman year of college. What was extremely odd, however, was that this woman, Sadie, had sent me the first message just hours after I had posted about Colin's death, and my subsequent haunting, on a different part of this site. Suffice to say, my curiosity was piqued, so I responded. What follows is a transcript of my conversation with Sadie via Facebook Messenger. Sadie, Sunday, August 9th, 2020, 4:52 p.m. Hi, I know you don't know me, but I really need your help. Well, it's Jules that needs your help really, but you know what I mean. She's not doing well, and you're the only person I could think to contact. She really needs her friends and family right now. 6:38 p.m. I know you didn't read my last message, and I know it hasn't been that long since I sent it, but I really need to speak with you. She told me everything about what happened back then. It seems like you really helped her through the worst of it. Please, get back to me. 11:44 p.m. I'm really sorry to keep bothering you, but you don't understand how serious this is. You know she's always struggled with her mental health, but there is something really wrong with her. If there was anyone else for me to turn to, I would, but she is refusing to seek professional help. 8:16 a.m., August 10th. Please respond. Maybe you haven't been reading these, so you don't know that they're about Jules. I've tried to be persistent, so maybe next time I'll try being direct. She really needs you. She doesn't really have anyone else. 12:05 p.m. Please. It's about Jules. Me, Monday, August 10th, 2020, 12:08 p.m. Okay, you have my attention. How do you know Jules? Sadie, Monday, 12:08. She's my girlfriend. Me, Monday, 12:09. And what exactly did she tell you about me? Sadie, 12:11 p.m. Well, she told me that her boyfriend died in a car crash and she was badly injured. She said that her friends, but most of all you, did your best to get her through it. She said that you helped her feel like she'd make it through physical therapy, that you're basically the reason she can walk now. 12:13 p.m. She said she knew you all were hurting too, and that she couldn't bear to let you put your pain on the back burner to help her deal with hers. So eventually she closed herself off from the rest of you. She told me that she missed you the most. I didn't know if that last part was true, but the first half definitely was. I'd spent hours in the hospital and at her house just hanging out and talking things through. Maybe it was easier for me because I hadn't really lost Colin like the rest of them. Those weren't details that just anyone would have had, so I decided to trust her. I messaged her my phone number and told her to call me later, when my fiancé would be out of the house. Our phone call was brief. Everything started with the death of Jules' mother a month prior. It turned out that Jules had never really stopped practicing. or trying to practice, witchcraft. Something that Sadie was fine with. What Sadie was not fine with was the recent interest Jules had taken in black magic. She told me that Jules would lock herself in their spare bedroom for hours on end, trying to open some sort of gateway between this world and the next. She'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped going to work. Her goal of contacting her mother was all-consuming. Sadie told me that Jules thought I could help her open the gateway, since I was part of her coven. Sadie thought that maybe I could pull her back from the brink and convince her to attend therapy. I agreed. I haven't had as much money coming in since quarantining and social distancing started, so I was relieved when Sadie told me that she'd reimburse me for my plane ticket. With all my reservations mitigated, I set about booking a flight for the next afternoon. I don't think Colin was convinced, though, because my phone shut itself off 3 separate times while I tried to book the flight. I think he was trying to tell me not to go. I wish I'd listened. My fiancé drove me to the airport the next day. He doesn't have much of a stomach for the paranormal, though he is the only guy who stuck around after I told him about Colin. So all I told him was that I had to go back to my hometown to help an old friend who was having a tough time. I'm pretty sure he knew there was more to it than that, but he didn't push the issue. The flight went smoothly, and once I landed in Seattle, I called Sadie to pick me up. We met near the baggage claim. Despite seeing her profile picture on Messenger, I was afraid I'd have a hard time picking her out of the crowd. I didn't. She was easily the tallest woman I've ever met. She was probably around 6 feet tall with bright red hair and a golden brown tan, despite living in the most overcast part of the country. She greeted me with a warm smile, and I grabbed my bag and followed her to her Jeep. We made small talk for the duration of the 2-hour drive, all the while carefully avoiding discussion why I was there and stopping along the way for dinner at a fast food place. As I reached the edge of town, dread filled my gut. I hadn't been back there since my parents had moved across the state during my sophomore year of college. It wasn't at all like I remembered it. The sky was full of dark clouds, and a heavy sense of foreboding seemed to hang in the air. Everything looked darker than it had been 8 years ago. It was like something out of a Stephen King novel. I tried to tell myself that I was overreacting. I was so used to the SoCal sunshine that the clouds just felt heavier now. I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that it wasn't true. We pulled up in front of the old Victorian house that Jules had grown up in. It looked even more menacing now. Jules' mom must have been sick for a while because the house was in serious disrepair. The shingles hung at odd angles, and the gray paint was peeling. And the lawn was brown and dead, even in the perpetually rainy climate of the Pacific Northwest. Sadie led me inside. Her sunny disposition and bright yellow sundress stood in stark contrast to the dark ambience of the house. I followed her up the stairs, but I already had an idea where we were headed. Just as I suspected, we'd come to a stop in front of the door to Jules' childhood bedroom. Sadie knocked lightly on the door. After a minute of silence, she pushed it open. I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Jules looked relatively the same as the last time I'd seen her. Her hair was still shoulder length and dyed bright blue, and she was still wearing heavy eyeliner and all black. She was too thin, though. All skin and bones, and her face was creased in frustration. The walls were covered in some sort of archaic scrawling, and the bed had been pushed back against the wall to accommodate a large pentagram drawn in chalk on the floor. Jules sat in the center of the pentagram, hunched over a heavy-looking book with yellowed pages. She looked up with gaunt eyes as Sadie opened the door. Her face broke into a smile when she saw me, but it was more unsettling than friendly. She stopped whatever she was doing and pulled me into a weak embrace. She said quietly that she was glad I decided to come. I muttered a response, but I don't remember what I said. I was too concerned about how frail she'd become and how creeped out I was by the room. Sadie was able to coax her out of the room to eat with the promise of continued conversation in the kitchen. Jules followed us down the stairs and ate a sandwich that Sadie had made her, while I told her about what had been going on in my life for the past 8 years, omitting the mention of Colin. She had been so desperate for him to contact her after he died that I just didn't have the heart to tell her that he'd been hanging around for nearly a decade. It was oddly comforting to be in the kitchen again, almost as if no time had passed. Once Jules was done with her sandwich, however, she was all business again. She began explaining to me how she and Sadie had moved into the house less than a week after her mother had passed. The veil between the worlds of the living and the dead was thin there, and how she could sense her mother's spirit. She told me that she and Sadie had dug out her old Ouija board and tried to conduct a seance, but her mother was too weak to communicate at length. That's where the ritual came in. Jules explained that she'd intended to go through with it, but had lacked the support of a coven. She said that with me and Sadie participating in the ritual with her, she'd be able to combine our energy with her own. She believed that this would strengthen her magical ability enough to tear a small hole in the veil and allow her to make contact with her mother on the other side. I had my misgivings about the whole thing. For one, I didn't think that Jules had any magic in her tiny body. Colin had always been the one to contact the dead, and while we'd done a number of spells in high school, I don't remember any of them having worked. However, when Jules went back upstairs to prepare for the ritual, Sadie asked me to just go along with it. She told me that it wouldn't do any harm to indulge Jules, and once she saw it didn't work, she'd give up. Sadie thought the two of us could convince her to let go and get the help she needed. I reluctantly agreed. It wasn't long until night fell, and I found myself being led into the woods behind Jules' childhood home. It felt like we walked for hours in the dark, though I know it couldn't have been more than 15 minutes. There was a cold breeze, and the dim light of the quarter moon barely pierced the dense foliage. We finally came to a stop in a small clearing. Jules took her backpack off and unloaded her ritual supplies. Among them were the large book for the creepy room, several candles, and a large, ornately decorated knife. She began to light the candles and lead Sadie and I through the grounding ritual. It all seemed like the basic stuff we'd done in high school. Then the ritual began. Jules opened the book and began to chant in a language I didn't know. It honestly didn't sound like a language anyone knew anymore. She took hold of the knife and sliced open her palm, spilling her blood on the ground in front of her. The flames of the candles grew brighter, slowly illuminating the entire clearing. I looked on in horror as a large, black figure began to emerge from the woods behind Jules. As it drew closer to her, it refused to be illuminated by the candle's light. It was as if it was made from the deepest void in space, like it absorbed the light around it somehow, making it darker. To my left, Sadie let out an ear-piercing scream. Jules, now distracted, followed her gaze. The book toppled from her hand as she turned. By the time it hit the ground, she was sprinting back towards the house, screaming for us to follow. My legs were shaky, but they obeyed Jules' command and I took off after her. I ran as fast as I could toward the trees. I only glanced back when Sadie's scream began anew. I wish I hadn't. There wasn't much of her left by the time I turned my head. The tattered remnants of her yellow sundress were soaked with blood. Tendrils of darkness interwove with what I think were her intestines and maybe other organs. They wrapped around the broken pieces of her ribcage and seemed to have split open her chest and stomach. I could see her lungs deflate as her screams died with her. Survival mode kicked in, and my head snapped forward, my legs somehow moving even faster than they were before. The woods passed in a blur as I tried to focus on Jules running ahead of me. When we reached the house, she threw the door open. I raced inside, slamming it behind me. I looked around frantically for something to barricade it. I shoved a small bookshelf in front of it before I heard Jules yelling for me to join her in the kitchen. I practically threw myself into the room. As soon as I was in, she threw me a container of salt, instructing me to pour it on the outside and the inside of the doorway. I did as I was told. And when I was done, she grabbed a lemon and drew something on the back of the door. She took the salt from me, dragged me to the center of the room, and poured out a salt circle around us, all the while muttering something under her breath. As soon as she was done, the room began to shake violently, as if huge gusts of wind were buffeting the side of the house. Pots and pans rattled, dishes and glasses fell out of the cabinets and shattered on the ground. Jules handed me a small cast iron pan, motioning me to cover my head and curl up into as much of a ball as possible while seated. I didn't know how long the shaking lasted. I lost track of time after a few minutes of it. I must have blacked out or fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I can remember is sunlight streaming through the curtains that hung on the kitchen window. Jules and I exchanged a long look, both of us unsure if it was actually over. After several minutes, we sat up. That's when she said it. A single word that broke my heart. Sadie? I shook my head, and she broke down. I held her as she sobbed uncontrollably into my shoulder. When her tears finally ran dry, she let go of me and stood up. Cautiously, she put one foot out of the salt circle, then the other. She crossed the floor carefully to avoid all the ceramic shards and broken glass. She opened the door to the kitchen and stepped out into the rest of the house. Warily, I joined her. The rest of the house was unaffected by whatever had happened to the kitchen. The bookcase remained firmly in front of the front door. Jules pushed it back into its original place along the wall and just looked at me for a long time. She looked like she had aged 5 years in that one night, and her dark eyes were full of sadness. After a while, she suggested that I grab my bag so she could drive me to the airport. I tried to talk her out of it. I tried to convince her to call the police. And when that failed, I tried to convince her to go back to California with me. Her only response was to tell me that she belonged in the old Victorian house, and that she would handle everything. That was last Wednesday. As soon as I got home, I could tell that something was wrong. There was an unfamiliar emptiness to my apartment. When I'm alone in my room, I actually feel like I'm alone. It feels like Colin's gone. I don't know if ghosts can be forced over to the other side, if Jules' ritual somehow severed my connection to him. or if something worse has happened. I'm scared. And not just for him. I gave Jules my number before she dropped me off at the airport, but I haven't heard from her yet. Maybe I'm just being paranoid, but I'm worried that whatever came through the hole she tore in the veil didn't go back through it. I'm worried that it's on our side, and it got Jules. If I'm being completely honest, I'm terrified that I'm next.
Chronicler here. We here at Creepy Spaghet would like to thank Zilthewarrior for allowing us to tell their story. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to stay updated on these terrible tales, and make sure to check out the author in the links below. If you're interested in having your story narrated, be sure to reach out to our humble overseer as he continues his journey to pull the darkest stories from the infinite depths of the internet. Until next time, fiends. And remember, we are darkness.